Welcome back, time travelers, to Old Book Time Traveler. This is OB. Today we're going to continue reading from our book titled A Pictorial History of the United States. And if you remember last time, we left off with discussions of the native inhabitants as well as some of the early colonies that had started. We're beginning today with the Anecdotes of the Pequod War. One of the early laws of New England was some minister is to be set forth to go along with the army for their instruction and encouragement. Moreover, they sometimes began their wars by season of fasting and prayer. We may smile at this strange attempt to intermingle religion and bloodshed, but it exhibits the Puritan character. The whole night before Captain Mason set out from the Hartford to attack the Pequods was spent by Mr. Stone at the request of the soldiers in earnest prayer. Again, having arrived at Narragansett Bay on Saturday, instead of proceeding on their journey the next day, they kept it as the Sabbath, with the most scrupulous exactness. War is horrible at best, but it is always delightful to find its horrors in any degree mitigated. While the soldiers of Captain Mason were slaughtering the Indians at Fort Mystic by hundreds and actually piling the dead bodies in heaps, they spared the women. Many of the Indian women, observing this, cried out, "I squaw! I squaw!" but it did not save them. The friendly Indians under Uncas, Sachem of the Mohicans, and the Minnetonka, Sachem of the Narragansetts, were terribly afraid of the Pequods, and especially of the Sassacus of their chief. When Captain Mason inquired of Minnetonka why the Narragansetts did not come forth and help him, he replied, "Sassacus is in the fort. Sassacus is all one God. Nobody can kill him." The 200 Pequod men, women, and children were surrendered to the colonists, were either enslaved by the English or incorporated with the Mohicans or the Narragansetts. There did not remain a setup or a squaw, a warrior, or a child of the Pequod name. A nation had disappeared in a day. Still, this war would have been more dreadful than it was, but for the benevolent and pious labors of Roger Williams. When the Pequods found they had provoked the colonists to make war upon them, they tried to enlist on their side the Mohicans. The Narragansetts, they hoped that by their united exertions they might be able to entirely sweep the colonists from the hunting ground of their fathers. There was no white man in New England that dared at this crucial time to expose himself to Indian fury, but Roger Williams, aware of the danger to the colonies, this good man, amid storm and wind, and at the most imminent hazard of his life, embarked in a canoe and hastened to a wigwam of the Narragansett Sachem, even while the Pequod ambassadors were there, still reeking with the blood of the Oldham and others. Here for 3 days and nights he ate and drank and slept in their midst, in danger of being shot or having his throat cut every moment. The Narragansetts for some time wavered, but he at length succeeded in preventing them from entering into a league with the Pequods, and thus probably saved the colonies from extinction. Settlement of New Haven. First settlement at New Haven. The Indian name of New Haven was Quinnipiac. The people of the Connecticut colony had become acquainted with it during the wars with the Pequods. About this time, Reverend Mr. Davenport and 2 merchants of London by the name of Eaton and Hopkins and a company of immigrants came over to America, and Mr. Eaton and a few others went to Quinnipiac and built a hut and remained there during the winter. In the spring of 1638, Mr. Davenport and his whole company went there to reside permanently. At 2 different purchases, they bought the Indians nearly the whole of what now constitutes the county of New Haven. For the first and smallest portion, they gave a dozen each of coats, hoes, hatchets, spoons, and porringers, 2 dozen knives, and 4 cases of French knives and scissors, and for the largest, 13 coats only. Some may think the Indians were defrauded by these purchases, or at least would be likely to think themselves so after. But such persons forget that these articles were worth more than they are now, and besides that, the land was really worth nothing to the Indians, nor much to anybody else. Besides, the Indians retained the right to hunt on the land, and if they pleased, to plant a certain portion. On the first Sabbath, which the colonists kept regularly at New Haven, April 28, Mr. Davenport preached to the people under a large spreading oak. Mr. Davenport was a most excellent man, and with his coadjutors gave a tone to the character of New Haven that had never been wholly lost. The laying of the city into squares and the beautiful green or common are memorials of their efforts. The three towers, Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield, early in the year 1639, formed themselves into a distinct government and adopted a constitution, and John Hayes was elected as their first governor. Their constitution had been much admired. It lasted with little alteration till 1818, or about 180 years, and was in substance as follows. The General Court or Legislative Assembly was to be held twice a year, via the spring and autumn, but the officers of the government, the governor, deputy governor, and 5 or 6 assistants, with the representatives from several towns, were to be elected on the first Monday of April annually. The settlement at Saybrook soon became united with that at Hartford. Until the year 1665, New Haven was a colony by itself, separate from Hartford, under the name of the Colony of New Haven. A constitution was formed and adopted by the colony, essentially that of Connecticut, in the autumn of the same year, 1639. Theolephasus Eaton was chosen the first governor, and he re-elected every year till his death, which happened about 20 years afterward. The first inhabitants of New Haven, almost without exception, were men of learning and piety. They paid great attention both to education and religion. At first they had all their property in common, as at Jamestown and Plymouth. Not a few of their first governors, moreover, as well as several other officers, refused to receive any salary or special compensation for their public services. The Dutch, who still claimed the country, seemed inclined from time to time to molest the Connecticut colony, but no serious or at least bloody engagements ever took place between them. Their greatest trouble was with the Indians. With this exception and a continual series of disasters at sea, their first years were quite prosperous. The first great earthquake in New England after its settlement took place in June 1638. The earth shook with such violence that in some places people could not stand without difficulty, and the furniture in its houses were thrown down. Similar shocks were felt in 1663, 1727, 1761, and 1783. Union of the New England Colonies, delegates signing agreement. The conduct of the Puritans in New England did not fail to keep up the spirit of persecution in those whose high-handed measures had driven them there. The forms of the English church discipline were seen to be disregarded, and marriage to be celebrated even by civil magistrate. And in spite of all this, good and loyal subjects of the king were continually emigrating. What could be done? In the first place, ships freighted with passengers and bound for New England were forbidden to sail. In the next place, the Archbishop of Canterbury and others obtained power to legislate for the colonies, to revoke their charters if thought necessary, to regulate and govern their church, and to inflict punishment for refractory conduct. Such power lodged in the hands of the Episcopal bishop 3,000 miles distant, greatly armed the colonies. In January 1635, the ministers assembled at Boston to conduct with the civil officers and see what to do. They were unanimous in the opinion that they ought not submit to a general governor from abroad should one be appointed, which they had great reason to expect. So this is a map of New England. And if we look here, here's Portsmouth. And then it has Kennebunk. There's Augusta. So there's Bangor, Maine, Frankfurt. If we go down here, it was just talking about Windsor. This is Concord. Bellows Falls, for those of you who know where these places are. Northampton. And there's the Massachusetts Bay, Boston Bay. There's Salem. And then we have Hartford down here and Providence, Plymouth. Plymouth right there. Nantucket. And here's the Long Island Sound with London right there. And New Haven. Nor was this all. Poor as the colonists were, they raised 600 pounds sterling among them and applied it immediately to the erection of fortifications. But this only so much as the more offended their enemies in England, and increased their disposition to stand the way of their liberties. Whole squadrons ready to sail for America with passengers were stopped. It is even said that Cromwell and Hampden, who were afterward become so conspicuous in the measures which led to the death of the king, were on board one of the vessels, and would have sailed for America had not the king himself prevented it. Little did he know what he was doing. It was impossible, however, to check the tide of immigration except for a short time. Persecution for religious opinions had awakened a spirit of immigration in Europe, which had not been known before. 198 ships had already crossed the Atlantic to New England, carrying with them 20,000 passengers, and the plantations there had cost nearly $1 million. It was just at this period of the colony history. It was just at this period of the colonial history when they were in danger, not only from foes at home, but from enemies of their liberty abroad, at a union of the colonies for mutual preservation and defense began to be discussed. Nor did the victory over the Pequods, nor the temporary suspension of Dutch hostilities lull them into security. The measure was not only talked of, but executed. The Articles of Confederation were signed May 29, 1643. The union which was formed took the name of the United Colonies of New England. It embraced Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, and should have included Rhode Island and Providence plantations. This colony petitioned for admittance, but was refused because it would not be merged into the colony of Plymouth. This union lasted 40 years or more and was of great service while it lasted. If it did not prevent that foreign interference which was threatened, it defended them, and at least from the Indians and Dutch, and other enemies at home, both by leading them to feel more strongly ties of sympathy and brotherhood, and by enabling them to make treaties on a more certain and permanent basis. The Indians of New England. Our New England ancestors had so much to do with the Indians whom they found here before them, that a history of the country will hardly be intelligible without a brief notice of this singular people. They were principally the Penobscots in Maine, the Pawtucks between Maine and Salem, and Massachusetts around the Massachusetts Bay, the Penobscots in southeastern Massachusetts, the Narragansetts around Rhode Island, and the Pequods in the southern or southeastern part of Connecticut. There were indeed other tribes and divisions of tribes, such as the Mohicans, the Nipmucks, the Wampanoags, but they were not numerous, and were generally tributary to the larger tribes. Nor were the larger tribes so numerous as some have hastily supposed. The best authors on the subject have set them down as only 150,000 for the eastern, middle, and southern states. It says Indians and villages. Indians had no houses, but lived chiefly in rude huts, or as they were called, wigwams. They were built in the shape of tents. These wigwams were usually arranged in small clusters of villages, one wigwam often serving for several families. Like the wandering Tartars, they often removed their villages. A village contained usually from 50 to 200 inhabitants. The Tartars. Interesting. We'll have to do more research on those. They knew little of agriculture, though in some places they raised corn and beans and few peas, melons. The employment of men were chiefly hunting, fishing, and war. Of arts and manufactures, they barely knew enough to be able to make their wigwams, weapons of war, hunting, articles of dress and ornaments, and a few domestic utensils and agricultural implements. Their food was simple, coarse, plainly cooked, and from their natural indulgence sometimes scantily. At times they subsisted chiefly on flesh, raw, roasted, or boiled according to convenience. At other times, when not too lazy to procure it, they subsisted on parched corn, hominy, or a mixture of corn and beans, which they called succotash. The females usually prepared the foods and raised the vegetables. Their dress, except in winter, consisted of a slight covering about the waist, with ornaments about the face, wrists, or ankles. In winter they dressed in untanned skins and in furs. They were little affected by external beauty, even personal beauty, notwithstanding their fondness for ornaments. In war they painted their faces. For amusements they danced around a fire or sung songs or recited stories of their victories. Their hatchets, knives, and other implements were culinary or warlike, were chiefly shells or sharp stones, more frequently the latter. They pounded their corn in large stones, scooped or hollowed out. The ground served them for chairs, tables, and beds. Their thread for nets was made of the tendons of animals or of coarse bark, and their fishhooks of bones. For money they used wampum, or beads made of shells. The Indians had no books or schools or churches. They had, it is true, some idea of good and evil spirits, and perhaps of a future existence of the grave, but their notions on this subject were very crude, not to say confused, and their religion and religious worship, when they had any, exerted but little influence on their general conduct. Polygamy was allowed among them, and though they could hardly be said to be distinguished for licentiousness, there was not among them that tender and respectable regard for the female sex, which is not only a principal element of human happiness, but one of the strongest bonds of society. Their government and customs of war will be seen in the progress of our history. This is Indian sorcerer and sick man. Diseases among the savages of America were fewer in number than in civilized society, but they were sometimes very fatal, as in the case of smallpox. Their medical treatment was simple, consisting for the most part of a little herb tea and warm or cold bathing. Sometimes, however, they resorted to powwows or sorcerers who pretended to charm away diseases. When an Indian died, the survivors dug a hole in the ground, and having wrapped the corpse in skins and mats, laid it therein. Whatever was deemed most useful to the individual while living, as his implements of war or hunting, were buried with him, probably in the vague belief that they might be useful to him in future state. Some corpses were buried sitting, their faces to the east. Eliot, the Indian apostle. Eliot preaching. One of the more important as well as more interesting results of the union of the colonists was the civilization and improvement of the Indians. During the peace with them between the Pequod War and the War of Philip, it pleased God to put into the hearts of many to do them good. Among these benefactors were several persons of the name Mayhew and John Eliot. One of the Mayhews had a church of 100 communicants at Martha's Vineyard. His son, experienced Mayhew, besides having the charge of 5 or 6 congregations of Indians, learned their language and translated portions of the Bible into it. He also wrote the lives of 30 native Indian preachers and 80 pious Indian men and women. He spent 63 years of his life in the ministry, chiefly among the Indians. But no man was greatly distinguished for his labors of love among the Indians as John Eliot. He was born in England in 1604. In early life he was an usher in a grammar school under the Reverend Thomas Hooker, the celebrated individual who led 60 men, women, and children across the woods from Boston to Hartford to settle Connecticut. Mr. Eliot came to Boston in 1631 and was settled as a minister in Roxbury the next year, where he remained about 60 years, or until his death. He had not been in Roxbury very long before he began to take a deep interest in the Indians, whom he believed to be the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. The first thing he did for them was to learn their language. This took him several years. The translation of the Bible into the Indian language took up to 2 years more. At the age of 42, he found himself sufficiently acquainted with their language to converse with them and teach them both publicly and in private. Soon he was found in their wigwams, teaching them and their children to read, praying with them, telling them about God, preaching short and serious sermons to them, discouraging the use of strong drinks as well as their favorite vices, instructing them in farming and gardening, and endeavoring in every way possible to make them wiser and better. Mr. Eliot not only told them what to do, but he actually set them to work, and sometimes worked with them. He furnished the men with spades, shovels, crowbars, and the women with spinning wheels. He set up schools and churches among them, and prepared ministers and schoolmasters. So faithful and numerous were his labors that he has obtained the names of Indian apostle. The following anecdote will serve to show the nature of Mr. Eliot's influence. One Sabbath evening, coming in from church, a converted Indian found his fire gone out, and in order to kindle it, he split a little dry wood with his hatchet. This was thought by many of the Indians as a breach of the Sabbath, and was, at their next meeting, taken up and discussed. Mr. Eliot labored more particularly around Boston, in Roxbury, Dorchester, Newton, Watertown, and Natick. He was especially employed at a place called Nonatum, now in Newton, and at Natick, but he was also abroad and labored in the region about Lowell, Lancaster, Brookfield, Yarmouth, and elsewhere. He translated the Bible and other books into Indian language. In short, what he did was incalculable. In 1660, there were 10 towns near Boston in which Indians were, for the most part, professedly pious, and were till Philip's War first adopting the customs of civilization. Even in 1686, after Mr. E.'s death, the number of praying Indians, as they were called, were estimated at 5,000, and in 1696 30 Indian churches existed. Mr. Eliot was regarded in his day as somewhat eccentric, but it was chiefly because he was good. He hated personal ornaments and useless expenditures. He was opposed to wigs, wine, and tobacco. He wished to have everything so managed that it might be accomplished the greatest good to mankind and the greatest glory to God. Witchcraft in New England. It was during the long period of peace, which has been alluded to in the foregoing chapter, that the troubles arose in Massachusetts about witchcraft, of which so much had been said in history, and on accounts of which such heavy charges have been made against our forefathers. The first case of the kind occurred in Springfield in 1645. In June 1648, the charge of witchcraft was brought up against Margaret Jones of Charleston, and she was executed. Anne Hibbins of Boston came next. She was executed in 1656. Here the subject rested for about 30 years, when it was again revived, and there was one more execution in Boston. 4 years afterward, around 1692, the supposed witchcraft broke out in Salem and Danvers. Here the first subjects of it were children. This disorder, whatever its character, may have been spread to the neighboring country towns, particularly Andover, Ipswich, and Gloucestershire. At first it afflicted the lower classes only, but at length it pervaded all ranks and conditions. 2 daughters of a minister in Salem were strangely affected. Before this they had been quiet, happy children, but now they began to look wild, shriek, tell strangers stories, sit barefoot among the ashes, or go abroad with their clothes and hair in great disorder, looking like insane people. Sometimes they were dumb. At others, they would complain of being pricked severely with pins. The madness continuing to spread, the charge of witchcraft was at length brought against one poor minister himself. All sorts of strange stories were told about him. It was essentially said that he had intercourse with the devil, and the fact that he was an uncommonly athletic and strong man with many favored this idea. He would not confess guilt and was hanged. Those who confessed the crime were not executed. It was indeed a fearful time. Multitudes were suspected and accused, and at one period no less than 150 were in prison for witchcraft. What number were actually executed while the fever lasted was not quite certain. It is generally said that 200 were accused, 150 imprisoned, 28 condemned, 19 hanged, and 1 pressed to death. But the excitement at length passed away, and the more rapidly in proportion as the criminals were treated with clemency. Multitudes owned at length that they confessed their guilt to save their lives. For a century past, little had been said of witchcraft in the United States, and still less has been actually believed. Nor was this disease or delusion much known in this country, even in its day, out of New England. One old woman was indeed accused of the crime in Pennsylvania. Penn himself happened to be the judge and gave the charge to the jury. They brought in a verdict that her friends should be bound to her to keep her peace, but which put an end to witchcraft in that province. Supposed cases of witchcraft had been common in Europe for centuries, and about the time of excitement in New England, thousands were executed in England and other countries. And I think that's where we'll end today, travelers. So join us next time as we continue reading. This is Obi with Old Book Time Traveler. Enjoy your travels.